Hey guys, all right. Hope you've had a good week so far. Okay, we are starting chapter 18, the final chapter of the book tonight. And like I wrote you guys last night, I'm sorry for the delay in posting this first video. It has been a busy week here in the Thompson household. So I apologize for that. Tonight we're going to really do the first three sections of the chapter. Only two videos that we're going to do this week. We'll do this first one tonight, and then do the next one. Hopefully, the next couple of days. I want to post that one by Saturday at the latest, if possible, or Saturday night. So, where we're at in chapter 18 is that we're in the later Middle Ages. If you think back to chapter 17, we were in or we had begun the Middle Ages, also known as the medieval period. And the Middle Ages, again, is that time period, especially in Europe, in between the fall of the Roman Empire and modern world history, which is basically going to begin with an event called the Renaissance. The Renaissance is going to be the primary event that's going to begin modern world history. And we'll get into that a little bit next week, okay? Next week, I'm going to do either a video or doing our Zoom meeting. I'm going to talk a little bit about the lead up to the Renaissance, kind of bridging the gap in between the later Middle Ages and where we're going to start in August. Okay, so tonight we're going to be looking at really the first three sections of chapter 18. And the reason we're doing three sections at once is because they all relate to each other. It all comes down to the Catholic Church and the powers of the Pope of the Catholic Church. Okay, so keep in mind that last chapter we talked about the idea of feudalism, and under feudalism, what we have here is a social system to where the kings and the queens are pretty much the top, and then you have nobles and knights and peasants. Now, as we get into the later Middle Ages, then what you have happen is that the Pope of the Catholic Church is going to begin to gain more and more power. Okay, powers of knights and powers of nobles are going to begin to decline, and that's really going to be a long progression. That as we get into the 1000s AD, and really going into next year, as we get into modern world history through the 1600s and the 1700s. What we see is a very long progression of nobles and aristocrats losing power over kings and queens. We're going to kind of see a cycle here of who has the most power. You know, it began in the early Middle Ages with pretty much the nobles and the knights had the more power. We're now to a point here to where kings and queens are gaining more power over the nobles. As we begin this chapter, then we're going to see where the popes of the Catholic Church are beginning to gain power. As we get into the 1000s, now the Pope was the head of the Catholic Church. Okay, we talked about this a few weeks ago. That when it comes to the Catholic Church, the Pope is the leader of the Catholic Church. He is the end-all, be-all of the Catholic Church. Now, before that ever actually took place, the Pope of the Church was again the head of the Catholic Church. They were seen as God's representative on earth, and so as a result, most Catholics are going to put the Pope on a really, really high pedestal. You're talking about the leader of the entire church here. That Catholics are going to put on a pretty high pedestal in regards to respect, in regards to leadership, and really being at the mercy of the Pope. One of the reasons that popes are going to gain power here in the 1000s has to do with the idea of what's called excommunication. Now, excommunication means that you are banned from the Catholic Church. And the Catholic belief is that if you are excommunicated, you're no longer part of the Catholic Church. And the Catholic belief is that you cannot go to heaven if you're not part of the Catholic Church. And so how the popes begin to gain power here is based off the fact that the popes had the power to excommunicate somebody or to kick somebody out of the Catholic Church, and with that, people were terrified. People were terrified of going against the Pope, of the possibility of not going to heaven. And not only with just regular people, but that fear is really going to expand all the way to leaders of nations, to kings and queens, monarchs and emperors. to where the Pope has that much power again, basically comes down to the fact that I don't care if you're king or queen or emperor, if you have the Catholic belief system, then you don't want to make the Pope angry, because if you do, then the Pope could excommunicate you, which means that if you die while you're excommunicated, then you're not going to go to heaven. Again, that's the Catholic belief here. And so as a result, what you see here is that the Pope is not only gaining power among Catholics, but they're gaining power among leaders of nations, because leaders of nations are terrified of being excommunicated and therefore risking not going to heaven. We see that in England and in France. And we have the modern day countries of England and France that are now established as we get into the 1000s AD. And you have very powerful kings in those countries. And we also have the establishment of what's called the Holy Roman Empire. Last chapter we talked about Constantine and talked about his voyages and his conquerings. And what happens as a result is, give me just a second here, guys. I need to double check something. I'm sorry, Charlemagne. I knew I had that name wrong. Not Constantine, Charlemagne. Charlemagne in the 700s is going to build an empire in the central part of Europe, and the Pope is going to pretty much put him in charge of what's going to be a new Roman Empire. Okay, we talked about that last chapter. That empire is going to be called the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, the Holy Roman Empire is pretty much going to begin in the 700s. Now, let me go ahead and explain this. The Roman Empire that we talked about several weeks ago and the Holy Roman Empire are two different things. It is not the same empire. The Roman Empire has already ended a long time ago. The new Holy Roman Empire was the belief here that this new empire is going to be the reestablishment of the Roman Empire. And it's called the Holy Roman Empire because of the influence of the Catholic Church and the popes over the emperor. So the Holy Roman Empire never gains the kind of magnitude and stature that the Roman Empire did. Okay, there are two different things. The Holy Roman Empire is going to last for a long time. You're talking about from the 700s going into the 800s AD. It's really going to last for about 1,000 years. You're talking about the 1800s. When the Holy Roman Empire comes to an end. So the Holy Roman Empire lasts for about 1,000 years. Now, that being said, they never quite gained the power that the Roman Empire did. Okay, we'll talk more about the Holy Roman Empire next year and their role in Europe. So you have three primary countries or nations here of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, and all three all three were known as Catholic nations, which means that their allegiance is going to lie with the Catholic Church. And that means that the Pope has a lot of power over these kings and queens. And so that's what leads to the raising of the power of the popes, where, again, in pretty much every single social structure we've seen this year, including feudalism, the king or the queen or the pharaoh or the emperor or whoever the leader of the nation is always at the top. Okay, now you might have a priest or somebody else there with them, but nobody's ever above the king or the queen or the leader. That happens here. Okay, the Pope is going to eventually go above the kings and the queens, and the Pope will be the most powerful being in many of these countries. That's the kind of power that we're getting here because of the threat of excommunication, that threat of kicking somebody out of the Catholic Church. And the threat of somebody not going to heaven as a result of that means that the Pope is going to gain more power in some cases than many of the kings and queens in Europe. And that's going to happen for a long, long, long time. So we're seeing a transition here of going from feudalism and going into this new system to where the popes have a lot of power. One of the biggest instances that kind of solidified this was the situation of Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV. Henry IV is going to try to call for the removal of Gregory, basically tries to get bishops of the Catholic Church to remove Gregory as Pope of the Catholic Church. Well, instead, Gregory is going to kick Henry out. He's going to excommunicate Henry. And again, the belief here is that if you are excommunicated or kicked out of the Catholic Church, then you can't go to heaven. And so Henry panics. He's been kicked out of the Catholic Church, and he wants to make sure that he has a chance to go to heaven. So Henry is going to go to Rome, which is where the Pope is going to be. A little side note here. The Pope and the leadership of the Catholic Church is going to be just on the outer limits of the city of Rome, at a place that we now call the Vatican City. The Vatican City is its own little independent city outside of Rome, Italy, and that is pretty much the headquarters of the Catholic Church. So Henry is going to go to the outskirts of Rome where Pope Gregory is, and for 3 days, Henry is going to stand out in the freezing cold snow, barefoot, begging Gregory to accept him back into the Catholic Church. And after 3 days, Pope Gregory VII is going to allow that. And so that situation there is just one of the instances that solidifies the power of these Catholic popes over monarchs, over kings and queens. And that's saying a lot, because as we go further into Europe, into the 1000s, the 14, 15, 16, 1700s, then the monarchs of Europe are going to be the ones that have a whole lot of power. Okay, we get into the idea of absolute monarchs next year. Basically, nobles and aristocrats, their powers are gone, and the person that has the most powerful or the most power in a country is the monarch, either the king or the queen. And the popes at this point in time even had more power than that. And again, it comes from that political pressure. I say political pressure. It comes from the pressure of kicking somebody out of the Catholic Church. So with that being said, we're going to go now into sections 2 and 3 and talk about what's called the Crusades. Okay, we have to understand the power of the popes to understand what happens with the Crusades. Now, the Crusades is a series of wars that take place, and is going to begin in the 11th century, at the very end of the 11th century, around 1095 AD. And what happens with the Crusades is that this is going to go back down to the point that we talked about back in chapter, I think it was chapter 12, either chapter 12 or chapter 13, where we talked about the Muslim empires. Okay, so if we're looking at a timeline here, we look at the Roman Empire. The old Roman Empire had taken over the city of Jerusalem. Now, the city of Jerusalem was considered as a holy city for the Jews. Okay, first of all, that was their original homeland. That was the original Israel. And when the old Roman Empire came in and invaded that territory, if you think back to what we talked about a few months ago, then the Jews are going to revolt. And as a result, the Romans kicked the Jews out of Jerusalem and out of the Holy Land. And from that point on, what used to be called Israel was going to be controlled by the Romans. As the Roman Empire fell, then you have these Islamic empires in the Middle East that take over what used to be Israel, and took over the city of Jerusalem. You fast forward to this point in time here, and the city of Jerusalem is seen as the Holy Land by Jews, by Christians / Catholic Church, and by Muslims. And the reason for that being is that for the Jews, again, that was their homeland. That was their original territory of the original Israel. For Christians, Catholics, and Muslims, Jerusalem went back to Jesus. Again, Jesus, by all three of those beliefs, Jesus was a very, very important man. For Christianity and Catholicism, Jesus was the Son of God. He came to this earth to die for us all, and then they believe that after 3 days of being dead, he rose from the dead, and then ascended into heaven. And so Jesus is the Messiah according to Christians and Catholics. Now, again, Muslims don't quite believe that. They do believe that Jesus was a prophet. The important part here is that Jesus was a very, very crucial man in regards to Islam, Catholicism, and Christianity. So for all of those groups, Jews, Christians, Catholics, and Muslims, Jerusalem is seen as the Holy Land. And for many years at this point, the Holy Land had been ruled by a group of Muslims. Okay, these Muslims in the Middle East. Okay, and according to Catholics / Christians, having Muslims in control of the Holy Land which is something that was just downright wrong. Okay, we talked about there are a lot of similarities in between Christianity and Islam, and there are a lot of similarities. You're talking about Jesus being important in both. You're talking about the core beliefs of Christianity and some of the aspects of Islam. There, believe it or not, are a lot of similarities there. But Islam is definitely, when it comes down to it, much different than Christianity. And Christians, for many, 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 many years, have seen Muslims as people who are teaching false doctrine, as people who have taken Christianity and they have perverted it to be something that is not supposed to be. And so, as a result, as we go into the 1000s, the idea that Muslims have control over the Holy Land and over Jerusalem is just wrong in the eyes of the Catholics. Again, keep in mind here that when I say Catholics, in your book it's going to say Christians. Okay, again, to me, there is a difference between Christianity and Catholicism. And so, for this part right here, Christianity in Europe does exist. But only in very small sections. The main group that we're talking about here are Catholics. Again, the power of the Pope over the Catholic Church. Most people in Europe, especially Western Europe at this point in time, they were Catholic. So in your book, it's going to say Christian, but I want you to understand that it's really the Catholic Church and Catholics themselves that are pretty much leading the way here. Again, nothing against Catholics versus Christians, things like that, but it is important. And for me, it helps to kind of organize it like that, so that as we go further next year and we separate this and we separate out the idea of Christianity and the Christian denominations after the Protestant Reformation and Catholicism, there is a big difference. So for me, it's a little easier to understand if I break it down into this is primarily the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church, or specifically the popes here, want to retake the Holy Land. Okay, it is wrong in their eyes that these Muslims, that these Turkish Muslims, have control of Jerusalem and the Holy Land, the holy city, and that needs to change. So as a result, the popes are going to put pressure on many of these kings to send their soldiers to go fight. Okay, there is no Catholic army. And so as a result, if you're going to take back Jerusalem from these Turkish Muslims, then you're going to do so with the help of these different nations, these kings and the queens and their armies. And so as a result, the popes here are going to put a lot of pressure on these Western European monarchs to send their soldiers to the Middle East to take back the Holy Land from these Muslims. And again, as we just talked about, the popes had a whole lot of power, a whole lot of influence here. And so because of that power and that influence, many of the kings are going to agree. Again, they don't want to make the Pope angry. They don't want the idea of being excommunicated from the Catholic Church and possibly not going to heaven. And so they're going to follow suit. Again, this is another example of how powerful the popes are. So beginning around the year 1095 AD, then we begin what's called the First Crusade. And again, the Crusades, as they're going to be called, because I think there's 5 in total. The Crusades are going to be the effort by the Catholic Church, by the Pope, and by these Catholic, or by the kings and queens of these European countries to retake Jerusalem and the Holy Land from the Muslims. And that's what the Crusades were all about. It was all about taking back the Holy Land from the Muslims, pushing it back over into what they called Christianity at the time, to having it controlled by the Catholic Church. So the First Crusade is going to begin around the year 1095 AD. Okay, it begins with 5,000 crusaders who leaves Europe in search for the Holy Land. Again, this is modern day Israel, modern day Pakistan, the city of Jerusalem in the Middle East. And if you're looking at a map, I don't have one available. But if you're looking at a map, if you're looking at England and France and even the Holy Roman Empire and the distance to Jerusalem, that's a long way. Okay, no airplanes, no trains, no cars, nothing like that. It's all by marching and by horseback riding. And so you're talking about a long distance here. So the first crusade begins with 5,000 crusaders that's going to retake the Holy Land. Okay, they will now along the way. It's not just a fight against the Muslims. You're also going to have fighting in between um, um, Catholics and the Jews as well. Crusaders are going to attack Jews in the area called Germany. And this goes back about 1,000 years before to the crucifixion of Jesus. Again, to the Catholic Church and to Christians, Jesus was the Messiah. He was the Son of God. And as the story goes, in the Christian Bible, if you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and their account of how Jesus died and was crucified, what happens is that the Jews are calling for the death of Jesus. Okay, I know that a lot of sources. That's kind of a controversial topic in that the Jews were responsible for Jesus' death. If you read the Christian Bible, which is what the Catholics believe and the Christians believe, then all four accounts said that the Jews wanted Jesus dead and that they ordered Jesus to be dead. Now, whether that's what you believe, that's up to you. Okay. Again, I'm just pointing out that that's what the Christian Bible says. And so Christians and Catholics, that's what they believe because that's what the Bible says. So because of that belief, then it's not just fighting here between the Catholics and the Muslims. You also have fighting in between Catholics and Jews in trying to get revenge on the Jews for the death of Jesus. So there is a little bit of a backstory here. Basically, the Crusades are nothing but a big old giant war in between Catholics, Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Okay, basically all four religions that kind of categorize as either Christianity or under the same God are at war with each other. In this first crusade, the Crusaders are going to be successful. And when I say Crusaders, I'm talking about those from England, France, Germany, of those Catholic nations that are trying to retake the Holy Land from the Muslims. The first crusade will be successful. You have nobles and knights that around the year 1099 are going to march in and retake Jerusalem. So the first crusade is successful, mission accomplished. The Catholics are able to retake the holy city of Jerusalem away from the Muslims. However, about 50 years later, right around the year 1150, I think 1147 to be exact, then what's going to happen is that you're going to have more fighting that takes place. Okay. The Muslims are going to attack to try to retake back Jerusalem. And this is pretty much going to begin what's called the Second Crusade. French and German kings are going to leave in the year 1147 to basically send in reinforcements to retake the land from the Muslims, but it will not be successful. As a matter of fact, out of the four, I think there are 5 crusades in total. The only crusade that is successful for the Catholics are going to be the first. Okay, they do retake Jerusalem right around the year 1100, but with the second and third crusades, they're going to lose it right back. The Muslims are going to retake Jerusalem, retake the Holy Land, and from that point on, the Jerusalem will be under the control of Muslim empires until the year 1948. Okay, it's going to take after World War II in the last 75 to 80 years. When we get the recreation of the modern day country of Israel. So it takes that long before we get to a point where Muslims are not in control of Jerusalem. And we'll get, matter of fact, this time next year, we'll get into World War II and the Holocaust, and we'll talk about the reestablishment of Israel and why that takes place. But the Crusades, when it comes down to it, I'm not going to go through every aspect of the Crusades. But very simply put, the Crusades are a failure, at least for the popes, for the European monarchs, and for the Crusaders, the Catholic Church. It is a failure. Again, the first crusade is successful, but with the second and third crusade, Jerusalem falls right back again into the hands of the Muslims, and it will stay that way. And so when the Crusades are finally over, around the year 1492, is what some people have it. I think it's a little late. I would say around the 12 to 1300s. is about the end of the Crusades. I want to say around the year 1291. So going from the 1200s to the 1300s, and I see now that that one source is saying that there were 8 crusades in total. Okay, there were 4 major crusades and then another minor crusades after that. So as we get into the year 1300, the crusades are pretty much over with, and again over about a 200-year period of fighting. Um, the Catholics here are not going to be successful. Okay, and this is about the point of where the popes really began to lose power once again. I wish I had a board to where I can kind of draw this out on a timeline. But we see a progression here that when the later Middle Ages begin around the 1000s, then the power of the popes are going to overtake the power of many of kings and queens and emperors. Okay, but because of the failure of the Crusades, because the popes were the ones that were putting pressure on these kings. The popes were the ones saying, you need to do this in the name of God and in the name of the Catholic Church, and it's your responsibility, and if you won't do it, then I'll find somebody who will. And again, the threat of excommunication there is going to put a lot of fear into these kings and queens to where they're going to do it. They're going to send their soldiers down. After 200 years of fighting and the failure of 6 or 7 crusades, these monarchs finally say, forget you. I'm not sending anybody else. This is a failure. We're never going to win this war. And so we're going to stop listening to you. So it is about that point around 13 to 1400 AD to where the power of the popes begin to creep back down again below the power of kings and queens and emperors in Europe. And the Crusades have a lot to do with that. So in wrapping this up, I'm going to take about 5 more minutes here to talk about the effects of the Crusades. Because, again, the Crusades were a failure for the Catholic Church and for the popes. But there were a lot of long-term effects because of the Crusade. The biggest one is going to be trade. Because you have a 200-year period here where European nations were trading directly with Asian nations. Okay, now we talked a few chapters ago about how there was trading going on back and forth between Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Eastern Asia, such as China. Okay, and these Muslim empires were pretty much the middleman of that entire trade route. Well, what you have here is that because for 200 years you have Europeans who are over in Western Asia, and so they're getting exposed to different resources. And they're taking those resources and shipping them back to Europe. And so there are a lot of resources that that Europeans are going to become accustomed to that they really didn't have a lot of access to before. So first of all, trade is going to increase between Europe and Asia. The Europeans are going to learn about products such as apricots, rice, cotton cloth. And so you have other things like spices and silk and jade. You have a lot of resources that many Europeans had not been exposed to a whole lot. That over the 200 years of the Crusades becomes a normal part of European culture. Now that the Crusades are over with, those items are now important resources. So you're going to set up a huge trading network to make sure that you continue to bring in those resources from Western Asia and Eastern Asia. So a giant trading network from Europe, Western Asia to Eastern Asia. The Jews are going to have a distrust for the Catholic Church because of attacks against Jews. Again, many of these crusaders are not just going after the Muslims here. They're also using this as a chance to try to get back at many of the Jews. And so as a result, you get more and more tension in between the Jewish people and the Catholics. And as we go further along, a lot of tension between Jews and Europeans. As we get to this point next year and we talk about the Holocaust, Hitler was not the first person that hated the Jews and that discriminated against the Jews. That's been going on for a long, long time. And so really the Crusades brings that out even more to where you have even more discrimination against Jewish people. Some kings are going to increase their power because the power of the nobles and the knights are going to die out. This whole idea of knighthood is going to pretty much die out, at least in regards to power. You still have a lot of countries here that have a lot of nobles and aristocrats, and they have a lot of power. Again, that's going to go into about the 1700s for many countries. But again, we're getting back to a point here to where the kings are overtaking the Pope here. The Pope is losing a lot of power. Nobles are losing a lot of power. Knights are pretty much dying out to where it's now kings and queens and emperors at the top again. And so a lot of long-term effects here. Tensions between the Byzantines, which is going to be modern-day Turkey, is going to increase in between Catholics of Western Europe and people of Eastern Europe, and in what we call the Byzantine Empire, later on the Ottoman Empire. And you have a lot of tensions in between Muslims and Catholics / Christians from that point on. And so a lot of long-term effects of where really the Crusades are going to change Europe. Okay, the Crusades are a failure, but this 200-year series of wars are going to really change Europe for a long, long time. Really brings us into a different time period of Europe. So, quick rundown. Trade increases greatly, which is going to bring us into the age of exploration next year. That's very, very important. We'll come back to this next year when we get into chapter 3. So trade increases. The power of the popes decline. Power of the kings and queens and emperors increase. Power of the nobles and knights decline. You have increased tensions in between Catholics / Christians and Jews. You have increased tensions in between Catholics / Christians and Muslims. Okay, so a lot of long-term effects here that as we look at Europe over the next several hundred years, a lot of things here that are being set up. Okay, so this wraps up sections 1 through 3, how the power of the popes leads to the Crusades. With our next video, we're going to finish out chapter 18, and again bring us into that point of bringing us into modern world history. We'll finish out the later Middle Ages. We'll briefly talk about the Dark Ages. We haven't really talked about that yet, so we'll go back and talk about the Dark Ages a little bit, and really wrap up the book. Okay, so I'll post my next video hopefully within a day or two, and we'll go from there. Hope you guys have a good night and have a good start to the weekend.